That's the number one key source of funding for public schools. And the ways that you qualify for the funding basically incentivizes poverty concentration and effectively segregation. And so we want to move away from that and try to create incentives.
ChatGPT can do a really good job making things sound good, be grammatically sound, but it loves to recycle phrases.
The library is a space. It's not only just a place that you can get things from, and it's for everyone. Anyone can walk in, and because of intellectual freedoms, you can get exactly what you want.
Welcome back to the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent. Since the COVID pandemic, K-12 students across the nation have been missing more school. Last school year, the number of Michigan students who missed more than 10% of school days was among the highest in the nation at nearly 30%. And the rate among Detroit students was more than double that. So how do we fix it? Wayne State University researchers Jeremy Singer and Sarah Lenhoff study educational equity. They believe the first step is to think of the problem differently. In their new book, Rethinking Chronic Absenteeism, Why Schools Can't Solve It Alone, Singer and Lenhoff urge school and local leaders to focus less on what happens in schools and more on the systemic factors that make getting to class so tough for students and their families. Jeremy Singer joins us in the studio now. Professor Singer, welcome back to the Metro.
Thank you so much. Yeah, great to be here and talk about this.
So, Professor Singer, we're going to look at some of the potential solutions to chronic absenteeism as you and Professor Lenhoff see it later in the show. But first, I think we need to lay some groundwork. You write that chronic absenteeism is an ecological issue. What does that mean?
So, yeah, we kind of use a metaphor for thinking about this issue as something that is complicated, it's complex. When you think of an ecosystem, you think of lots of interconnected parts. You think of people inside of a bigger context. And that's the way we like to think about absenteeism. So a lot of times we just focus on the student, or if we focus on a context, we might just focus on the school, but we should be thinking about their family, their neighborhood, and the broader context. So in the case of Detroit, we should be thinking about the city or the region, the organizations and institutions, the conditions that impact students and their families.
So in other words, this is not just about kids saying, I don't want to go to school, and parents saying, okay.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, of course, there are going to be times where kids say, I don't want to go to school, and there might be times where parents say, okay, but that does not explain enough of the problem for us to really focus on that as the root of the issue. The reason Detroit has high absenteeism rates, higher than most other major cities in the country, and obviously higher than the average here in Michigan, is because of the adverse conditions that students and families and schools face here.
I want to stay on that notion, the work that you did looking very specifically at Detroit public schools, which, as we mentioned, have some of the highest rates of chronically absent students in the nation. But Detroit is not alone. Could you talk about how analyzing what is happening here in Detroit is helping you to better understand how this can be addressed, the problem of chronic absenteeism in other districts?
Definitely. So first, it's worth saying that I think people listening are familiar with the challenges that Detroit students and their families face here in the city, and they would know immediately that these are not problems that are found only in Detroit. So there are other cities around the state. There are also rural areas, for example, that face high poverty rates and challenging circumstances. And then if you think about other states around the country, there are cities and regions that face similar types of challenges. So what we learned here, the specific circumstances are not maybe exactly the same from place to place, but there's lots of places where they might look similar. And then beyond that, even if you're thinking of a place that has greater resources or less hardship that families face on average, the reason that the students in that district who are chronically absent, the reason they may be missing school, it might be related to similar challenges. So even if you don't have a poverty rate around 30 or 40%, you may still have some families who are facing social and economic disadvantages that are creating the same kinds of problems. So the scope or the scale of the issue might be a little bit smaller, but some of the same root causes are probably there.
Now, Professor Singer, you find that students face barriers both within school and outside of school when it comes to getting them to regularly attend class. So first, I want you to tell us what those barriers look like for students within school.
Sure, absolutely. And these are the ones that, in conversations that I've had with educators and school leaders and district leaders, and some of the conversations that we're having more broadly, they tend to focus on these school factors. And of course, it makes sense because students are going to school or they're missing school. And so school is the focus. Things that matter a lot for students within the school are relationships, the strength of their instructional experiences. So are they engaged? Are they learning? Are they feeling safe and belonging? Do they have good peer-to-peer relationships as opposed to things like bullying or alienation? And then, there are a bunch of school-specific resources that can also matter. So access to things like school meals, access to transportation through a school system. Sometimes schools provide health support, whether they have a school nurse or a school-based health center. So, and then there's also resources sometimes related to if students are facing housing instability, McKinney-Vento services that schools help provide. So there are a number of instructional and relational factors, and then there are some direct resources that schools can provide in the event that families are facing transportation or housing or healthcare challenges.
And this really emphasizes, Professor Singer, how important it is that schools that have high concentrations of poverty have enough of the funding that they need to support students in these ways, because what your research bears out then is that when they don't, that's going to have a direct effect on their ability to show up to class.
Yes, absolutely. So our lens is focused beyond just the school. And so it's also the case that a city like Detroit doesn't necessarily have access to the full set of resources that might be required to meet the needs of Detroit citizens, of its families and its students. And so when you zoom into the schools in the city, it's no surprise that it's the same case, that schools oftentimes get extra resources, get extra funding when they have more students in poverty, but those often pale in comparison to the resources that they need in order to provide students with an educationally enriching experience, to provide the safety and culturally enriching environment that they need. It comes down to having enough staff members, being able to afford the right kind of resources and materials, and then, of course, being able to supplement all those things with direct services and supports for families when possible. And now you're starting to go beyond the classroom, beyond the school building, and schools, of course, have been made responsible for all those types of problems beyond the school building for a long time, but rarely have the adequate resources to truly address that.
Now, what about the barriers outside of school? What do those look like?
So big ones that we hear about are health and transportation. I'll start with health because it's the most obvious one. Just about every student you might talk to is going to say they've probably missed school at least some point in their lives because they had a cold or a flu or some kind of illness. But we know that in some places, Detroit included, health inequalities can lead to more often sickness. For example, just difficult environmental circumstances or access to resources and nutrition or whatever it is. And then there's, of course, access to healthcare and medicine that might help in the case that someone is sick, shorten the window that you're sick. There's also chronic illnesses, and so the same issues apply. In a place like Detroit, for example, we have higher asthma rates than surrounding areas, and it's also the case that you may be less likely to get the services and treatment for asthma that you might need, right? So that's just one example of how these issues can kind of compound over time. And then transportation. So transportation is really complicated. Sometimes when we talk about transportation, it sounds like we're just saying, can you hop in your car and drive to school, or can you hop on the bus? But you need to think about all the surrounding circumstances. So even for a family who owns a car, we learned about challenges related to conflicting work schedules, not necessarily always having someone they can turn to who can be a backup ride in case there's a conflict in schedule, or if you have some kind of issue with your car that day. Of course, if you have money problems, you might have trouble affording gas one week or repairing your car in the case of disrepair. And then there's other conditions like neighborhood safety. So maybe children want to walk or wait at the school bus stop or the public bus stop, but parents are concerned about safe conditions, whether that's weather in the winter or crime or other things like blight and vacancy that create an unsafe feeling in the neighborhood. So transportation problems sound simple, but they actually, again, involve the intersection of a lot of different conditions, where in the places hit hardest, like Detroit, it becomes more and more difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think a lot of folks are thinking about the fact that there are many unsafe routes that kids are taking to get to school. And then there's also the fact that roughly 30% of Detroit residents do not have a car here in the Motor City, and that makes it especially challenging to get to class.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And then, of course, we also have an even more complicated landscape here in Detroit because of school choice. Families are often attending schools that are even farther away than their neighborhood option. And so while that's a choice that some families make because they believe that's going to be what's best for their children, it can also create additional obstacles over time as they try and sustain that choice, which is farther away, and they draw on an increasingly strained set of resources to maintain that.
What about students taking buses to school? Are you finding, has your research shown that that's not really up to par?
Well, there are school buses and there are public buses. Right. From surveys of families, we learned that a relatively small set of parents are sending their kids to school on the public buses. There's a few different reasons for that we've learned through interviews. One is just that the public bus system is strained. There's been years because of the financial challenges of the city, and the city, of course, has invested in strengthening and improving the bus system, but still got a ways to go. And there's also challenges with the number of connections or stops or the length of time that would take students to ride the bus. And then, of course, some parents have concerns about safety, whether they don't feel like their children are old enough or knowledgeable enough to safely navigate the bus, or if they worry about the safety conditions waiting for the bus, walking to the bus stop, or even on the bus itself. So those are all things that we've heard. And then school buses, parents really like the idea of school buses as an option. Sometimes they have challenges even if they're eligible for the bus. For example, there needs to be an adult who's going to be there waiting with children to board the bus in a lot of cases. And so some of those scheduling and life circumstance issues that we've talked about earlier can play a role. But the bigger issue with the school bus is just how few students are actually eligible to ride one. So the Detroit Public Schools District has its own eligibility criteria for students. You have to live a certain amount of distance away, essentially beyond walking distance, but you also have to go to your assigned neighborhood school. And since there's so much school choice, that actually ends up being a relatively small share of students at every school. And then charter schools vary very widely in terms of what transportation they provide. Some provide no transportation. Some provide a bus that will pick you up similar to the Detroit Public Schools style, that traditional school bus. And some just provide a set bus route. So that's almost more similar to a public school, a city bus, where if you can get to a stop on time, you can board that bus. But if you can't get to the stop, then you don't have access to it. So the school-based transportation landscape is really fragmented. And what we've found through our analyses is that the minority of students in the city are actually eligible for or have obviously easy access to a school bus. And that's something that we've heard from parents over and over. They would love the idea of a school bus stopping in front of their house or very close to their house. That would be a huge help to them, but it's just not a reality, and it's financially and logistically extremely complicated.
Wow. And transportation, again, is just one of many factors contributing to chronic absenteeism. You're listening to The Metro on 101.9 WDET. I'm Robin Vincent. Our guest is Professor Jeremy Singer. He's co-author of the new book, Rethinking Chronic Absenteeism, Why Schools Can't Solve It Alone. And the phone lines are open. Have you struggled to get your kids to go to school? Tell us why. The number is 313-577-1019. Now, Professor Singer, your book argues for school leaders to reconceptualize chronic absenteeism, which implies the efforts that have been tried haven't quite worked out, or they did make a dent here or there, and then things reverted or stagnated. I want to go through some other efforts that have been made to address the issue and explain some of their shortcomings. I'd like to start with the role of the attendance agent, which, as you lay out in your book, they have many responsibilities.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Let me say one thing really quickly before we talk about attendance personnel, which is we do want school leaders and district leaders to think a little bit differently about this issue. But what we also mean is we want other people who don't necessarily think it's their job to be thinking about this issue to start paying a little bit more attention to it as well and think about what their role is. And I hope that comes through in the conversation we're about to have. So when you think about what schools try and do, there are limits to the resources, the tools, the strategies that they can usually implement. So with the attendance agents, for example, the Detroit Public School District employs a number of attendance agents who we learned from our work work incredibly hard and do great things to serve families and students in the district. And this is an increasingly common thing. So districts throughout the state and throughout the country are starting to hire attendance-specific personnel. This might sound to some people listening like the old-fashioned truancy officer, which is still in place.
Like it's punitive almost.
Yeah, exactly. That's still a role that exists lots of places. But the truth is, even for those truancy officers, and especially for these new attendance personnel, the focus is a little bit broader than just bringing kids to court or letting them know that there's the threat of court if they don't attend school. It's sort of a more broad role that thinks about implementing a wide range of strategies. So it can be routine phone calls and home visits. It can be developing innovative school-based things like incentives or rewards. And there's also the old-fashioned kind of casework of just trying to understand what's wrong for families and trying to connect them with the resources that might help. And as I've just described that, you're probably thinking, like you said earlier, that's a lot for one person to manage for a school, or even for a few people to manage for a district. And so that's exactly what we learned, is that the scope and the nature of the problem is extremely broad. And especially in a place like Detroit, the magnitude of that issue makes it really difficult for these folks to manage the caseload and to balance these competing responsibilities over time.
You write that attendance agents were asked to embody 3 role types: bureaucrat, school improver, and caseworker. So expecting all of this from attendance agents, I mean, was it simply unrealistic? Is it unrealistic?
Yes, the answer is yes. What we write about in the book is that if you're going to have attendance-specific personnel, we think it's better to try and focus on one of these primary areas or roles, or one of these approaches to the role, as opposed to trying to do it all. This is more true in a place like Detroit than it is anywhere else because of the sheer magnitude. So let's just take one example. One of the things that attendance agents are responsible for is regular contact to families whose children are missing school. And you have a growing list of students who you need to be reaching out to every week. And so by the middle of the year, you're probably at the typical Detroit school, you're probably reaching out to hundreds of families on a regular basis. Just the amount of time it takes alone to dial those families, not all of them are going to pick up on the first try or even that day. So cycling back to them over time, we know it's a huge work burden. And so in a way, you could imagine an attendance agent just spending their whole week on that. But in addition to that, they should be going out into the field and making home visits. They should be implementing school-based strategies, incentives, and other programs. And they should be trying to identify resources that can support the families whose issues are known to them. So you can start to understand how it becomes a little bit overwhelming for them to accomplish their work. So what we recommend is it really makes sense to think about narrowing or specifying exactly what these folks are focused on. And we specifically suggest something like a navigator. So they have these kinds of roles in higher education, in social services, and housing, people who help those families who are trying to engage with services or resources actually figure out what's available to them and efficiently access them and sort of follow up with them about that over time.
Before we take a quick break, I want to just quickly acknowledge the lasting impacts of the COVID pandemic on chronic absenteeism. Can you distill for us what your research has shown? Yeah,
well, we are documenting, just like some other researchers around the country, that attendance in Michigan and in Detroit has worsened a bit, and it hasn't really bounced back to where it was before the pandemic. The truth is that researchers everywhere are still trying to unpack exactly why that is. We have a lot of potential explanations, but the research itself is still emerging. But it's clearly that there were some disruptions to family, social, and economic circumstances. Even if those have bounced back to an extent, we still have some lingering challenges, like gas prices are still just as high. We have disruptions to students' mental health and well-being that we're concerned about, disruptions to their relationship with school and their relationships with their teachers and peers that we're worried about. So these are all possible theories for what's going on and why attendance hasn't quite gotten back to where it is. And I just want to say about that, a lot of energy right now is focused on, well, why is attendance worse than it was before? And how can we address those specific reasons that students are missing school? And that's, of course, important. But it's also important to remember that in a place like Detroit, absenteeism rates were already incredibly high. And actually, the district has worked very hard and is almost at pre-pandemic levels. I'm not sure quite where they'll land this school year, but as of last school year, they were very close to where they were before the pandemic, and yet their rates are still incredibly high. So that's where we always come back to, which is why we're always pushing the point that we need to think a little bit more broadly than just what a school can do alone.
This is the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent. We're discussing how to get kids back in school amid high numbers of chronic absenteeism. Our guest is Professor Jeremy Singer. We'll continue this conversation in a moment, and we're wondering if you've struggled to get your kids to attend school or what you see as potential solutions. The number is 313-577-1019. This is the Metro. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent. We're discussing chronic absenteeism. That's when a student misses 10% or more of school days, and it's a big problem in many districts nationwide. And in Detroit, the number of kids missing school is especially high. Last school year, over 65% of Detroit public school students were chronically absent. Professors Sarah Lenhoff and Jeremy Singer of Wayne State University study educational equity with a big focus on chronic absenteeism. Their new book is called Rethinking Chronic Absenteeism: Why Schools Can't Solve It Alone. And Jeremy Singer is in the studio with us today. We've been discussing how he believes schools and communities should address the problem. So, Professor Singer, eventually to get back to the COVID pandemic for just one moment, because again, although it is like in the rear view mirror for a lot of people, it definitely is not when we think about the effects that it's had on schools and education and kids. Now, eventually, Detroit Public Schools began to rethink chronic absenteeism and shift their focus to systemic barriers. How would you say weathering the pandemic, how did that inform how school leaders and community members have reassessed chronic absenteeism?
Yeah, the Detroit Public Schools Community District has been ahead on this issue compared to large districts nationally. I think if you compare them to other districts throughout the state, just because it's been such a big problem here for so long, they've been thinking about it more and more frequently and earlier. And so, they deserve a lot of credit for the efforts that they've gone through. Some of those have worked better than others. And we saw during the pandemic, and we document this in our research, as absenteeism spiked in the district and elsewhere, school leaders, district leaders, and some of those attendance personnel in the district really came to see the limits of some of the strategies that they had been working on. Now, of course, the district had in mind and has always had in mind that there are a broad set of reasons for why students are missing school. I think what we saw is that the pandemic really helped some folks in the district think about how should we be prioritizing those alongside or maybe in lieu of some of the other strategies that had a little bit more center stage in some of the earlier iterations of their attendance plan. And so I'll just call it a few really great initiatives that I know the district is undergoing right now. They wanted to prioritize meeting students' physical health and mental health needs and have invested in health hubs that are available to families across the district. They're strategically located in different schools. I think it's high schools, so that students in those high schools, of course, but also in elementary schools, middle schools in the area can also access those. And then they've also tried to increase the availability of resources, whether that's information about social services that are available or other district provided resources through family resource hubs, and have more broadly focused on expanding the set of services and kind of this sort of whole child, whole family focus that we know is part of the solution. Now, of course, to reiterate the main point from our book, it's awesome that the district is doing all those things and they've seen a lot of progress over time, but it's not something that the district is going to ultimately solve alone. So their efforts should be met with equal attention and support from local and state policymakers and community leaders as well.
Yeah, we're we're going to talk about that because what you're describing right now is a huge undertaking for schools. I mean, one of the things that you and I have talked about previously when it comes to chronic absenteeism and what schools are trying to do, and you just mentioned this, is offering more services to students and families. And in the past, you've said to me that that is to really try and make a school a place that people want to go to, that they can have like a positive association with. And so we talked about previously adding washers and dryers to schools and how that's one aspect of that. So this is a lot, though. This is a lot to take on for schools to say, we're going to try and offer these other services. We're going to try and make our school, the actual building, somewhere that parents and kids want to go to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are models for this. There's the community schools model, for example, which is very explicitly focused on integrating local resources and supports for students and their families into a school building. But that takes time, that takes those connections, and that takes people and resources to support the coordinating work and the integration of those things. Those are promising. You know, we've seen, for example, in New York and California, community school models have shown promise in improving student attendance and reducing chronic absenteeism. But the level of investment that's needed for those things is pretty great because you need someone or maybe multiple people at the school at the center of that. And, you know, I would challenge anyone to walk into a school right now and just find an employee who's already got a bunch of things on their agenda and say, okay, you're now also responsible for coordinating a great number of partnerships and figuring out how to make this all work and share data and share resources and connect with students and their families. They're going to say, well, that sounds great, but we're going to need someone else to help us with that.
We're talking about what it will take to solve one of the most pressing issues in Detroit schools and many others nationwide, and that's chronic absenteeism. Our guest is Professor Jeremy Singer of Wayne State University. He co-wrote the new book, Rethinking Chronic Absenteeism, Why Schools Can't Solve It Alone. And that is exactly what we're going to discuss right now. Professor Singer, in your eyes, solving chronic absenteeism means local and state leaders have to get involved, that this has to be a community-wide effort. But, you know, I think about some of the education reporting that I've done on chronic absenteeism, and I found it striking that it was not a subject that most local and state leaders really understood or were comfortable talking about. How do you change that?
Yeah, it's a great point. I do think, I mean, I can say for sure that folks at the Michigan Department of Education are thinking deeply about this. And of course, at the state level, you've got connections to lawmakers and legislators. But to your point, yeah, I mean, I think a lot of times our government leaders, whether it's at the city level or the county or the state, they look at the fact that we have separate school boards and separate school districts and will just sort of say, well, that's their territory. And for good reason, you know, it's not necessarily the case that folks outside of education should be reaching in and telling educators how to do their jobs. But in this case, you know, for an issue like chronic absenteeism, there is a role for our government leaders to play, our city leaders, our county leaders, our state lawmakers. And so it's really important for them to understand that this is an issue because the nature of the issue spans into all these other areas that they oversee, things like transportation, housing, healthcare, employment, childcare. These are all important areas that they're working on every day. And so it's worth thinking about what are things that they can do now and what are things they should be working towards in the long term that will help schools with this pressing issue.
So in your eyes, when people are thinking about who they're going to vote for, you think they should be asking the question, what is this local leader saying about chronic absenteeism?
Yeah, well, at least if I'm a Detroit parent, which I'm not a parent myself, at least not yet, but I'm a Detroit citizen. Of course, I study this. I'm going to be listening for what, are any mayoral candidates talking about chronic absenteeism. But what I would love to hear, and what I think a lot of the parents and the students who we spoke to in our work would love to hear, is someone who says, we're committed to making it easier for you to get your kid to school every day. Because we know that even families whose children have really good attendance, there can often be a struggle. It can mean straining the resources you have access to, drawing on the people that you rely on, risking being late to work sometimes, and you need that income to sustain your rent or your mortgage or whatever it is. And so, I think not only would it be great to hear mayoral candidates, for example, speaking to this issue as an important one to coordinate with schools on, but also more generally to hear them speak to the ways in which they recognize that this is a perpetual challenge, that families are concerned about this, and they would love to hear the ways that the city is going to help play a role in making it a little bit easier on them day to day to make sure their kids are safe and learning.
As briefly as you can, we have just about 30 seconds left. Why should other communities care about Detroit's dilemma, meaning the very high numbers of chronic absenteeism, especially if their community has much lower rates?
Well, first of all, in terms of our work on the topic, there is plenty to learn that might be applicable to families in your context, even if it's not immediately obvious to you. The other thing is what your schools are doing, because your schools are certainly doing something about it. They have a lot they can learn. And then we should all care about the strength and the quality of education for students everywhere in our state. That's going to improve our economy, that's going to improve our citizenry, and it's going to overall improve the prospects for Michigan.
Jeremy Singer is a professor of teaching at Wayne State University and associate director of the Detroit Partnership for Education, Equity, and Research. He's co-author of the new book, Rethinking Chronic Absenteeism, Why Schools Can't Solve It Alone. Thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
Thanks so much for having me.
Metro is hosted by Robin Vincent and Tia Graham. The show is produced by Sam Corey, Kerry Jr. II, and Jack Philbrand. Our senior producer is David Lyons. Our engineer is Nate Bender. Music and creative audio production by Sam Bobian. The Metro is a production of WDET, a listener-supported service of Wayne State University. This is 1019 WDET-FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation.